Let me know when you're say Mike's hot.
Go. And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at coalitionradionetwork.com. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalitionradionetwork.com, our new site, which replaces but does not eliminate coalitionradio.us, where a wealth of nearly 7 years of shows with radio, video, blogs, podcasts can be found going all the way back to about 2013. And what a 7 years it's been. We're doing a special Sunday night show in order to bring you two very important individuals, causes, contributions, if you will, to a world of freedom and a world with peace. Joining me for the second time, she is now officially a repeat offender. And Lynn, by the way, that's an honor in this place. Is Lynn Ulbricht. Now, anyone who comes to me from the libertarian community knows all about Ross Ulbricht. 2 life sentence, 40 years without parole. Not a single conviction on a violent crime. A first-time offender, an Eagle Scout. Someone who had committed himself to a lifetime, not of imprisonment, but of the free exchange of ideas, commerce, and people. Almost a poster child, if you will, and to a certain degree, he was a very young man when he was convicted. A poster child, if you will, for the libertarian perspective, viewpoint, lifestyle. A commitment, again, to an open life, free of fraud, free of government controls. We talk about self-ownership, body autonomy. We throw those terms around loosely. This was a young man who had actually, rather idealistically, had committed himself to those very goals. Tonight's important for a few reasons. Number one, Ross has served, I believe as of today, 2,421 days in prison, eclipsing literally every imaginable economic crime. Every one of them. Without any sort of legitimate due process. Of course, he'd been through a variety of cases in courtrooms. But without legitimate and intrusive, a sharp eye into the underpinnings of his conviction. It's important, too, because some of the techniques that were used to convict him, just recently this week, while we were preoccupied, I'll just leave it at that, as a movement, the United States Senate voted to allow and continue the allowance, if you will, of the very type of intrusive, warrantless searches that are the hallmark, if you will, and dare I dignify what happened here with the term investigation. And we have lost another opportunity to strike back at a government who is clearly interested in using whatever techniques possible to criminalize what we see as libertarians as ordinary, legitimate behavior. Lynn, welcome back to the Coalition. It's great to have you here tonight. It's the same time. I still look forward to that time when you come on and we have a cause for celebration, and there's a third person involved in the conversation who sadly cannot be with us today because of an intrusive, abusive government.
Great to be here, Pat. Thanks so much for having me again. And yeah, I sure look forward to that day too.
Well, in 2016, the Libertarian Party, by acclaim, and this is an important anniversary, this week coming up will mark 4 years of this, but excuse me, in the Libertarian Party, by acclaim, I believe it was 2018, voted to support Ross Ulbricht in every manner conceivable, in order to support his release, in order to support a thorough understanding that he was guilty, really, of no crime. There was no victim here. He simply was a young man ahead of his time who engaged in commerce and an approach to commerce that, quite frankly, would have made our founders proud. What's happened since the last time we've been here?
Well, I don't even remember what was happening when I was on last, to be honest. We've all been put in lockdown. So Ross is very much in lockdown. He's, for the last 2.5 months, has been literally in a cell for 22 hours a day. And he's actually very excited because next Thursday he gets to be, for 1 hour per week, out in the prison yard, finally getting outside. But he spends 22 hours a day literally in the cell, not in the unit, not walking around, which is normal. It's pretty rough. He's handling it really well because that's what Ross does. And he even had a meditation retreat, his own little meditation retreat in there, a long one. And, he's just doing constructive things, reading, writing, but it's, how can it not be tough to spend 22 hours a day in a cell? Literal cell, 8 by 10.
Has there been any behavior that he's engaged in since his incarceration that would lead to this type of heinous sentence?
Oh, the sentence itself, or this?
No, or I should say, I'm sorry,
lockdown.
the
lockdown's
the
because of
lockdown.
the virus. So everybody in the prison's going through this.
Right.
To supposedly stop them from, they're out 2 hours a day, but anyway, whatever. As far as his sentence, absolutely not. It's a violation of the 8th Amendment. It's cruel and unusual, very unusual for a first-time nonviolent offender to have anything close to something like this. And in fact, the person who was in charge and ran the Silk Road copycat site that went up after Ross was Silk Road was taken down and Ross was arrested, Blake Benthall, hasn't done any prison time at all, even though the government said the site was identical, only bigger, sold more drugs. So, there's not equal treatment under the law in any respect. The biggest drug seller who actually sold, or is convicted anyway, of actually selling drugs, which Ross is not, got 10 years, and he is the same offense level as Ross. 10 years. Ross is he's closing in on 10 years.
Right.
So double life plus 40 years without the possibility of parole is such an abuse of government power and such an overreach of that judge that it's frightening for all of us. It puts us all in peril that the judicial system can do this to someone. And he was young, it's like, they say, giving a life sentence to somebody who's, in their 60s and 70s, that's bad. But someone who's in their 20s and 30s, it's a horrendous, horrible crime, really.
In the past couple of years, we've become all sadly familiar with government techniques implemented in order to, and I'll use the air quotes here, convict someone of a crime. And I want to stress, first and foremost, there is never been a single shred of evidence that Ross Ulbricht was involved in any sort of violence. The rather poorly constructed notion that he was involved in a plot that involved murder for hire has been thoroughly disposed of. The government seeks no further action on that, and clearly if they could, they would. Yet they allow that fiction to continue to exist, if in fact they're not in part responsible for disseminating it. Creating this shroud, if you will, over this case so that it's virtually impossible for the average person to see anything other than the hype that the government surrounds it through. And that has to do with literally every step of this process, from the way in which data was collected to the manner that under which his arrest took place, and then actually to the criminal prosecution itself. So let's do a quick review, if you don't mind, of the manner in which this investigation took place. And it's eerily prescient. This is all about Ross Ulbricht. It's all about freeing Ross Ulbricht. But the object lesson that is so clear to us now is that any one of us could be Ross Ulbricht if, in fact, engaged with the government in anything representing confrontation. That the resources of the American government can be harnessed in such a way as to be laser focused on one young man who simply created a website from which copies were made, from which other people may have engaged in illicit behavior, for which there's been virtually no prosecution. While at the same time, when it comes to more serious issues around freedom of the press, the same government, accurately, I believe, allows internet providers to be regarded as simply carriers of a signal. So you've got this hypocrisy here. On one hand, if it's a government-sanctioned, government-approved media source, they can literally carry anything. If it's Facebook, if it's any one of the social media sites, they can literally transmit any sort of information, and largely they're given a free pass on it. What happened with Ross, and like I said, I want to go through some of the series here of government malfeasance, but why do you think Ross was so targeted?
I think it was the Bitcoin. No one had really heard of Bitcoin before Silk Road. It was the plaything of geeks, but it wasn't really known. And Ross really believed in the potential for monetary freedom through Bitcoin, and it was the only means of exchange permitted on the site. I mean, to use the site, it wasn't easy. You had to know how to use Tor. You had to open a Bitcoin account. You had to fund a Bitcoin account. It's not as easy as buying drugs on Craigslist or Facebook is now, by any means.
Right.
In any case, I do believe it was Bitcoin, and this was corroborated later by Snowden documents that were revealed by The Intercept. I believe it was in March of 2018, where it showed that the NSA was urgently tracking Bitcoin users a few months before the Silk Road takedown. I thought they were supposed to be going after terrorists, but I guess they thought we needed to be protected from Bitcoin users. And Chuck Schumer got on the courthouse steps and called for the takedown of Bitcoin and the Silk Road, and right in the middle of New York City and Wall Street and the financial powers. I think that it was very threatening, and now the cat's out of the bag. I imagine it will be more and more regulated. But I believe it was the Bitcoin. I think it was an idea. It was a dangerous idea to have this open market that could not be controlled, could not be taxed, used this anonymous currency. And because it obviously wasn't drugs, because as I said, the biggest drug seller on the site got 10 years. So, and then down from there, it goes down from there. The people that are convicted of selling a lot of drugs on the site, 5 years, 3 years. And so this kind of draconian sentence, shocking sentence, I think it's because they were very threatened. And they said they wanted to make an example of him. They've since put other people associated with Bitcoin in prison as well, not for nearly as long, of course. But I think it was that.
It should be no surprise.
I don't think they really care that much about drugs.
No.
Not really. I don't think they care about stopping drug use. That if they did, they wouldn't be waging this drug war that hasn't done a thing for it, to accomplish that.
Too many people make money off the war of drugs to actually want to stop the orderly transactions of drugs that take place literally on every street corner in America every night. So let's start from the top then. Chuck Schumer. If there is truly a Geppetto in this theater of the absurd that sadly has become Mr. Ulbricht's life, it would be Chuck Schumer. Now, Chuck Schumer, it should be no surprise that he does in fact derive a significant amount of money from Wall Street in the form of financial contributions. Now, as given his being the Dark Lord, if you will, of the United States Senate, banks eagerly treat to his door in Prospect Park in Brooklyn, money in hand, And in fact, some of those same banks, I would believe that have pressured the Silk Road investigation, now are actively legally involved in their own flavor of Bitcoin transactions.
Yeah,
The blockchain and
exactly.
cryptocurrencies are now amongst the hottest topics in Wall Street. And clearly they're going to, I believe, use, unfortunately, the tragedies that's around COVID and the civil disorder in terms of financial markets that takes place around COVID to further implement and accelerate the use of their cryptocurrencies. Now, remember, it's always not about cryptocurrency as a measure of freedom. It's whose cryptocurrencies those transactions are taking place in. So at that point in time, it represented an existential threat, if you will, to banks.
Yeah, and he was
to
on
their
the
very
Senate
core.
Finance Committee and the
Right.
Banking Committee of the House, not the House, the Senate Finance Committee and the Banking Committee, Banking and House, I can't remember the exact name, but yeah,
Right.
very much involved in those things.
And at his prompting, HSI, as we like to refer to it, Homeland Security Investigations, became actively involved in this. Now, if you could speak to the kind of turf wars that took place between various offices of Homeland Security as they sought to control the flow of information. This is all documented, by the way, the control of information through a variety of federal prosecutors, and how it ended up in Chuck Schumer's favorite Southern New York, if you will, courthouse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is all heavily footnoted on our website in something called Silk Road, The True and Untold Story. It's based on the public record. We have it in podcast form, in video form, and you can just read it too. And it's quite riveting because you're right. Once Schumer came out and saying, we've got to take this down, it became a big competition. Who was going to get the guy? Who was going to get DPR? And it started out with a Homeland Security agent called Jared Duyagan in Chicago, and he was going after a completely different person. And he'd been on the site for 2 years and over 1,000 hours under an alias. And even after Ross was arrested, was still convinced, and that's shown in records in this that we have on the site, still thought it was someone else, another perpetrator, Mark Karpelis, was his suspect. And this came out in trial under cross-examination, and the prosecution objected. And the judge at first was like, no, this is legitimate to question this person. But by the time court reconvened and took it up again, she said it was completely off limits and the jury was to forget they ever heard that there was another perpetrator. But in any case, so Chicago was involved, and agents in Maryland were involved. And actually, as regards murder for hire, it was never brought to trial at all. It was never convicted. It was never even brought before the jury in anything but basically talking about it. They were allowed to kind of talk about it and say, we don't, there's no murders, but just trust us. And we're not asking you to rule on it. And it's like, I thought courts were supposed to be, where juries actually are presented with evidence. But in any case, in Maryland, there was an indictment that did include it. It has now been dismissed with prejudice. So there's nothing legal about it at all. But it was based on the material provided by one agent. Two were involved, two corrupt agents. Carl Mark Force, who's a DEA agent at the core of the investigation, and who is now in prison, along with his cohort, Sean Bridges, who is Secret Service / NSA, and they're in prison right now for corruption, stealing a huge amount of Bitcoin off the site from vendors. And they had the ability to change anything on that site. They had keys, they had passwords, they could act as the lead administrator, Dread Pirate Roberts, without his knowledge. They could, and several other aliases as well. And they were key part of the investigation. And so that was Maryland, and they tipped off Mark Karpelis by seizing money from his account.
Right.
And met with his lawyers, I believe it was in Guam, to had a meeting, and Karpelis's lawyers, this is according to testimony by a government agent, their own witness, said that we'll give you a name if you back off our client. And very shortly after, Ross was arrested, so I imagine that was the name. It all involves Mt. Gox, and Ross was on Mt. Gox in terms of where he kept Bitcoin, well, like a lot of people did, and Mark Karpelis ran it. So I don't know exactly, but there was Maryland, and they wanted credit for this as well. And then New York, the Southern District of New York came in under Preet Bharara, who's Chuck Schumer's colleague, very close colleague for years, his main guy. And basically what I've heard is what New York wants, New York gets. And I guess New York wanted this case. And so even though Ross lived and was arrested in California, he was extradited, so to speak, back to New York City and in the Southern District of New York, and was tried and sentenced by a judge who Chuck Schumer recommended to the bench and Obama appointed. So, yeah. So even though there were lots of agents and places involved and they were all competing, ultimately, New York wins.
Ultimately, the competition was so fierce that essentially other offices of Homeland Security begged Maryland not to chase Crevel, not to seize his money, because that ultimately would have tipped off and did tip off the rest of their investigation. I mean,
right. That was Chicago. No, the first guy, Jared Reagan, begged them not to. He said, "I'm on the case. I'm getting this done," and they did anyway.
Right. So two rogue agents essentially jumped in using extortion, fear, and the implied force, I should say, of the federal government, coerced other players on the site to give them Bitcoin. In other cases, they outrightly stole Bitcoin worth untold amount of money, particularly if you were to measure it at Bitcoin's
Especially
height.
now.
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, destroyed any real chain of evidence. They're given the anonymous nature of the transactions themselves and of the management of this site, it is virtually impossible for even the most sophisticated IT personnel to understand who or what made which individual transactions and to what degree they were authorized, to the point where, essentially, a username became the object of the federal government's attention, not an individual, and that would, of course, be the Dread Pirate Roberts. Throughout their investigation, there was complete chaos and confusion as to who actually was DPR. And it was only and please correct me if I'm wrong, but in my reading, and by the way, I've watched the video, it's stunning. We linked to it in our pre-show publicity. It's on the site, it's free. You can watch it in a variety of ways. It's a technical view. It's a technical watch. You have to watch it and rewatch it. It's very accessible, but at the same time, the devil is truly in the details in this, because ultimately what the federal government did was prosecute, again, a username. The chain of evidence was destroyed. They used extra legal techniques to do that. And what I wanted to talk about this time, something called the third-party doctrine. And under the third-party doctrine, effectively, you give up your right to privacy simply because you give your data to the telephone company or to some type of internet service provider to transmit to someone else. That, at which point in time, your data becomes, open season. And that may sound like a grotesque simplification, but that's effectively what they used to do this. I'm going to quote the site for a second. Government agents can secretly rummage through everyone's internet traffic information without restraint, just as they did to Ross, because it is sent through an internet service provider or third party. The National Lawyers Guild responds. Let me just jump in here with this, and then I want your reaction. Something as socially, politically, and personally important as website browsing history requires updated consideration of privacy rights by this court before the government is given license to search it without probable cause. That's what happened here, wasn't it, Lynn?
Yes, absolutely. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they didn't seem to think that was so important. So really, the third-party doctrine is based on an antiquated ruling by the Supreme Court that's almost 4 decades old and based on the dial telephone. Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So it's like saying, and basically, yes, it gives them the freedom to rummage through all of our internet activity and without a warrant, in secret, with no oversight, and use it as they wish. And it's like saying, well, the dial telephone is like our telephones now, which of course are computers. And, now our telephones and the internet contain all kinds of relevant information and private information, like, our religious affiliations and our sexual orientation and our medical records and all kinds of relevant information. And they don't need a warrant to get it. So why even bother to get a warrant for anything? It's not, it's like you've got it all right there with no warrant and no probable cause. They can just, whatever they want to do, they can scarf up. And this is shredding the Fourth Amendment, our protections to privacy from the government. And it's and now they've just done something like you were referring to, this other what is it? It's a amendment that's even increasing their power. And the two pro-privacy guys had sponsored another amendment to force federal law enforcement agencies to at least obtain a warrant before getting through everything, going through all our internet history, and they lost by one vote because a bunch of people didn't even show up. And my question is, what good are these senators if they don't even show up for a vote that is so important to protect our freedoms?
And
what the hell are you guys doing?
And folks need to understand, this is not just happening on the federal level. Here in Rhode Island, where this show emanates, a couple of years ago, innocuously enough, the state government decided to create something called a state prescription medical database. And of course, privacy advocates, including the ACLU and the Rhode Island Medical Society, screamed bloody murder. The most famous words, and the words that literally send a shiver up every civil libertarian, were used. Well, if you've done nothing wrong, what do you have to worry about? Well, and of course, there would be considerable protections so that the police would not be able to access this. Well, again, in a middle-of-the-night law last year in Rhode Island, buried somewhere in the budget, and that's, by the way, the strategy these days with all of this legislation, buried in the budget was a little codicil to the bill, and it said, oh, by the way, you don't need a search warrant anymore. So there is no longer at least
just
the
by
presumption.
The way.
Yeah, by the way. So there is, and on all of these cases now, there is no longer at least even the notion that a judge of pure heart, if you will essentially, as we say on the coalition, balderdash to some outrageous request by a police department who is, in this case, in the case of Ross, in the case of so many of these cases, on fulfilling a personal agenda for a highly connected politician. Because that's ultimately what this all comes down to. We invest power at high levels of society, and these individuals then can use whatever the long arm of government is to invoke recrimination, criminalization, deprivation on whom or whatever they so choose that may be acting against their personal or their true constituents, in this case the banks, financial interests. So when
and one word I'd like to say to people that say that, oh, I have nothing to hide, it's not just that, and maybe you don't, but it is that these things can be used to blackmail officials. It can be used to pursue political enemies. It can be used for all kinds of nefarious things, and blackmail, politicians, influence all kinds of things through this with no oversight, in secret. This is bigger than just your personal thing. Although your personal thing, I care about mine. I want a door in my bathroom too. But privacy. You can't have a free society without privacy.
Right.
You just can't.
Right. And the Fourth Amendment stands as a wall, that sort of final wall, that final hurdle against an intrusive government from a complete invasion of not just your civil rights, but ultimately your criminal rights. Because there are multiple pipelines to prisons in this nation. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, sorry. I thought,
No, there are multiple
they had
pipelines to prison
seized,
here. I'm sorry. Go ahead. We have one of those internet
oh, you
connections where we
finish.
talk. No,
You
we
finish.
talk over.
I'll make.
You go ahead. You're more important here. You're the guest.
No, no. Well, I just wanted to just make the point, just to show it's if they had seized file cabinets in Ross's home, it would be clearly a violation of the Fourth Amendment. But because it was a laptop, it's like, well, that's not our founding fathers forgot to put laptops in the Fourth Amendment. It's
Right.
like it's papers, but it's absolutely the same principle, and it's not being honored as that. Who has file cabinets? I don't have any.
Nope.
It's all
No,
digital.
we all have Dropbox and Microsoft. This or that. We've all got different ways to. We have Google Docs, and ultimately all of it now. You might as well all those different protections that you put on against criminals, all the different ways that you can lock down your credit file, all the ways that you can block third-party companies. Where do we get to do that with the government?
Yeah.
We don't anymore.
Good point.
There is absolutely nothing at this point in the year 2020, at the height of COVID, the height of possibly the greatest medical crisis this nation has ever faced. There is absolutely not standing in between us and a government other than the goodwill of whom or whoever may happen to occupy a potential office. There is absolutely nothing. There are no limits, no boundaries. There are no protections anymore.
Well, that's been proven by the whole COVID thing, hasn't it? It's
absolutely.
Forget
absolutely.
right of assembly. Some of these governors are just over the top, in my personal opinion. And they're just violating our rights, right and left.
Well, if I can draw an analogy, it's because much like in the case of a criminal case where right to innocence is presumed, that being a kind of an outdated notion at this point.
Notion.
Yes, exactly. In the case of privacy, the laws sit squarely in favor of the government. You need to have either overwhelming guile in preventing the government from finding your records or overwhelming money to protect yourself in a criminal case, because the presumed innocence now, the presumed power, if you will, sits squarely with your government. And that's why Ross's case has relevance on two fundamental levels. Number one, as a basic human right, that Ross Ulbricht is a political prisoner being held for by a terrorist government, my words, not my guests, who seek to exterminate any flame of idea, conversation, potential, or even as an example, as a mentor to other folks who might follow in his footsteps. And then, of course, on the broader scale, he represents exactly what can happen to all of our rights should we find ourselves in similar situations. I want to get to...
and really, Ross is not unique. He's not unique. I mean, it's a very shocking and complex and case, but there are thousands and thousands of people that are in cages that are nonviolent, and the criminal justice system has been weaponized against. That's what they're doing. They're weaponizing the criminal justice system against Americans and other people. And, over 60% of prison population are nonviolent drug offenders and some immigration offenders. Nonviolent. They're fueling this beast, this mass incarceration beast and money machine with human lives. And these are nonviolent people. They're not a threat to anyone. And it's shocking. And it's not how America used to be. And it's not American, period.
Right.
It's wrong. And you're right. I mean, they're just running the show however they like. And there's this drug exception. That means the Bill of Rights goes out the window. And, they're doing whatever they want.
In the interest of personal safety, a pall of fear has been placed over our populace to create an environment, whether it be a reaction to the tragedy of 9/11, whether it be a reaction to COVID, whether it be a reaction to any existential threat, real or created, can be used to march people away from their civil liberties.
Absolutely.
And again, the term, the weaponization of government, is very, very apt. If you're just joining us, folks, Lynn Olbrecht is with us. We're discussing, again, an update to Ross's situation, his case, where he stands in the legal system. In its most simplest gesture, I would ask folks, and in the age of Twitter and hashtags, it's almost obscenely simple. I would ask folks to employ the term and the hashtag Free Ross. Not because that in and of itself will accomplish really anything. I always get a kick out of Hollywood celebrities who somehow manage to perform the Herculean task of tweeting out their thoughts and prayers to someone. But what I have found is that at its most simplest level, employing the hashtag Free Ross provokes conversation. And given what we're about to discuss with Ross's legal situation, it is conversation that develops thought. And thought develops reflection. And reflection ultimately leads to outrage. And outrage ultimately leads to the type of collective political action that we need to engage in at some level as a society to say, no, it's wrong. It's time for Ross Ulbricht simply to come home. He has served a sentence exponentially more difficult than whatever basic civil crime he may or may not have committed would call for. Wall Street magnates have taken far more, abused an entire society, and served far less. Violent criminals are left at least with an opportunity for parole, an opportunity for redemption, despite having committed heinous crimes against individuals in society, not property crimes. So that's why, at simplest level, I would ask you to do that. The second step, of course, is given a time when very many people are home and they've got time on their hands, invest about 30 seconds of your time and go up to freeross.org and actually begin to read and begin to investigate, expand your horizons. And then if you've got a couple hours one night this week, don't binge watch whatever nonsense is being spewed by whatever cable network. If you want a movie to watch, it's right there on freeross.org. A 2+ hour in-depth treatment that will make every Matt Damon thriller look as patently ridiculous as they become after you've had an opportunity to watch this movie online. And then, of course, is the next step. And the real step that actually involves commitment. Actually, go up online. This will take a few more minutes of your time. Sign the petition. And then take the next step, which is if you happen to be a libertarian watching this and you're a member of the libertarian movement, whether you're a big L, a little L, or medium-sized L, whatever, reach out to your local affiliate and ask them, have they, in fact, signed a letter that's being disseminated amongst libertarian affiliates, particularly at the state level, and ask to know if they've signed that. Because what's happening now is we're simply trying to create a statement from every libertarian leader in the nation requesting, politely, the attention of President Donald Trump to engage in a clemency process, to somehow find whatever legal method you want to call it to mitigate and end his term, and to find justice and allow, at some level, and allow Ross Ulbricht to go home. That's it. If Americans of goodwill simply engage in that collaborative process and not just give voice to their demand for civil liberties, not just give some superficial chat room experience to their demand for civil liberties to be enforced, but actively, maybe put themselves out a little bit and engage and demand that the Fourth Amendment protections that are afforded to us allegedly be retroactively talented young man with a future that could contribute in so many different ways to our society. And yet we've allowed the federal government, in the form of one Charles Schumer, to hijack the entire American legal system to laser focus on one young man and whatever civil property laws he may have or may not have broken at the time. Lynn, you know, we talked about some of the processes involved in it this time. I was particularly stunned after rereading and rewatching the video how ham-handed, and I'm trying to be polite here, the arrest process was in terms of, number one, their decision to single out Ross. Number two, how they collected evidence and what techniques they used to collect evidence. I mean, the chain of evidence, it's an oversimplification, but the chain of evidence upon which every American criminal case is based was completely destroyed by hand-handed attempts by people of the NSA, literally a alphabet soup of government agencies. Tell us a little bit about what happened when Ross was arrested.
Well, agents seized his computer, his laptop, and protocol was broken time and again. I'm not a tech person, but I can say that there was an agent who had the unsupervised, which is against protocol. There's always supposed to be more than one. Had that laptop for 3 hours. He could have done anything he wanted on it. They ultimately crashed the computer. They ended up, I've had tech people say they are such bozos. I mean, it was just pathetic to the point where it became, quote unquote, a useless brick. But what was submitted to court was a copy of a copy of a copy. And one of the main points in this is that I'd say all the evidence except one witness who testified that Ross told him he had passed the site along. One witness was the only witness to this. Everything was digital and up on a screen. And the jury was told, no, you can believe what's up on this screen by the judge. And I'm like, digital evidence is so vulnerable to manipulation, tampering in so many ways. All you really need now, with the precedent set with this case, using digital evidence, you can make stuff up all the time. All you need is, maybe if you want to get fancy, Photoshop. But to accept digital evidence in a case like this, where it's just so fragile in a way. I mean, I've had crypto experts tell me that it's child's play to manipulate this. And yet that's what we got. And then we wanted to bring our own technical witness who would have shown that, in an open source network, which Ross was on, and anonymous, you can't say who was doing what.
Right. And
he was not permitted to testify in court. And yet the government witnesses, were allowed to, go on and on. So it was very one-sided. The narrative was extremely controlled. And by the way, Ross's libertarian beliefs were not allowed to be mentioned to the jury. The fact that he was a libertarian could not be mentioned, because I think it's because that would evoke sympathy. A lot of things weren't allowed to be mentioned. It was the fact that there were legal items on the site was not allowed to be mentioned. Mm-hmm. It was basically a very carefully controlled narrative, and the corrupt agents who we referred to before, they were not allowed to be mentioned. So the jury had no idea that there were two corrupt agents who had free access, unfettered to the entire site, could change anything they wanted, and they were there for months. Could also, I think, create a chat about murder for hire with DPR, which, by the way, I just saw somebody put up. Wired had a thing about DPR and the agent, and there's a picture of Ross at the top. They never say it's Ross in the article because there's no proof of that, but they put up Ross's picture, so it's that kind of manipulation by the media that really enrages me. But in any
Well,
case, and they do it all the time, as I'm sure many people listen to you, all of you know. But yeah, so the whole thing is so stacked against the defendant, and that's why 98% of people plea, even when they haven't done what they're pleading to, because they're bullied and threatened by prosecutors. The prosecutors threaten their families, I've been told, and by someone who they did it to. And so they of course they plea, because 1% of those people that go to trial win. And then if you don't win, which you're probably not going to, you get a much worse penalty and a much worse sentence. If Ross had
right,
pled, he wouldn't. I don't know what she would have given him, because that judge is a hanging judge, so she's
right.
a whole other level of horrible. But thankfully retired. But yeah, it's the system is so stacked against the defendant and so tailor-made for the jury to hear exactly what the prosecution wants them to hear.
Right.
And it's not just Ross's case. This goes on all the time. It's
So
weaponized against the people.
So this is a case which has been from the very onset. This criminal investigation has been compromised at so many different levels. In this case, you literally had
tainted.
right from its earliest inception. You had members of the law enforcement community at the federal level actively involved in managing and mismanaging, if you will, the very site upon which Ross's entire criminal conviction is based. Mm-hmm. Carrying through multiple stages, multiple abuses of power. There were several times during this investigation when particularly the folks from Chicago looked at this as a hopeless investigation and were actually contemplating at some level, abandoning it at some level, until in case you had the continued New York and Maryland interference. You had a group of individuals who were hell-bent to convict Ross Ulbricht of something. Ross Ulbricht needed to go to jail from day one. Ross Ulbricht of the world.
Somebody did.
Yeah, they needed to be taught a lesson.
Somebody did. Yes.
Right.
Well, made an example of.
Right.
That's the big thing. If you do, you're like the head on the spike of the medieval castle. If you do this, this will happen to you if you do this. Of course, it didn't work after the sentence. There was a huge upsurge in darknet markets, but yeah, it was definitely, they needed their man. They wanted, and actually Chuck Schumer said publicly to Eric Holder, "Congratulations, you got your man," before trial. We hadn't had a trial yet. I'm like, hello, innocent until proven guilty. This is a public letter in his state where the trial was going to be happening, as if that wouldn't influence a jury pool. This is a United States senator.
Right. Who continues to hold himself out as a figure to be idolized, as representative of all that is good and great about American government. I just anecdotally.
And by the way, who receives big donations from private prisons to his campaign.
And we see in the conditions that private prisons are engaging in during this time of COVID, when organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union are going out there and having to essentially beg infirm prisoners to be taken out and putting on ankle bracelets or anything just to get them out of these private prison hells.
And the public ones aren't that great either, but yeah.
Right. No, but the entire picture is so thoroughly corrupt that in no way, shape, or form should Americans assume that law enforcement is interested in anything other than its own self-propagation.
Right. In my opinion as well.
So
prosecutors are all involved with their career. I've had a former prosecutor, now a defense attorney, tell me, he said, "Lynn, they will lie, they will they will lie and they will cheat to get what they need, to get that conviction. They'll hide evidence," which happened in Ross's case with the corrupt agents.
Right.
and to further their career, which happened in the case of Ross's prosecutors. They're all stepping up higher levels, or working for the private sector or whatever. And
Right.
it's a career move to have a high profile case like that.
Yeah, it's essentially what every prosecutor, what every journalist, what anyone from who's going to get jailbait to clickbait to everything in between is dreaming of this moment when they can catch someone in their crosshairs that they can turn into their own private industry. So what going forward? What
well said.
I mean, look at it. Again, you talked about an esteemed magazine which carries great weight, at least at some level in the technical community, can't help themselves to get a few extra clicks out of engaging Ross's picture in a situation where it's completely inappropriate. I mean, he has become tech clickbait, and it's disgusting at every level that none of these folks have the integrity at some point to stand up and say, what happened here? So
right.
What is, we've only got a few minutes left, and I think we just, until this is over, and hopefully that'll be very, very soon, but until this is over, I think we just need to have like a sort of a regular coffee date here online, just to keep us in the loop.
Great.
What is, at this point in time, Ross Ulbricht has no judicial appeals, does he?
No, he's exhausted all his judicial appeals.
Right.
He went all the way we went to the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
And there were two questions at the Supreme Court. One was the Fourth Amendment, and our lawyer, Canon Shamagam, one of the top attorneys in the country, who took the case, not because we could pay his regular fee, but because he thought it was very important. And he thought we had a chance with the Fourth Amendment argument against the third-party doctrine. But that didn't work. They didn't take that. And the other one was a Sixth Amendment argument, which is that the judge used uncharged, unconvicted allegations of murder for hire to justify her draconian sentence. And this is a violation of the Sixth Amendment. The Sixth Amendment was created and written to protect the accused from rogue judges, essentially, who said, I don't care what a jury says. I don't care if a jury said anything, which in Ross's case they didn't. I think it's true, so I'm going to use it. This is happening in our country, apparently has been for a long time. I had no idea before I got all involved in this about a lot of things, but one of them is that you don't have to be, you could be acquitted or not even charged like Ross, and a judge can use it against you anyway, because they decided they know better. Now, we're supposed to have a jury of our peers of 12. Of course, they're no longer our peers. There was not one person on that jury who understood. Well, maybe there were a couple, but most of them had no clue about Bitcoin, tech, any of it. And it's hard. I'm not blaming them, but they're not his peers. And I think 10 out of 12 were over 40. They did not have the technical, savvy.
Right.
So didn't really understand it. But in any case, we're supposed to at least have 12 people, not one judge deciding these things. And that's our Sixth Amendment. And that was, they didn't take that one up either. They're continuing to allow this. So
wow.
I forget what you asked me, but I was just saying, the exhausting the appeals. So that was the Supreme Court, and it was a devastating day when they didn't take the case. I was really we all thought we had a chance.
Right, at least on
so
one
now,
of the two.
Yeah. And one of the two. And anyway, so now our best chance is a commutation of the sentence by the president, who has shown that he cares about justice in the sense that he has pardoned or issued clemency in one form or another to many people. And so I'm just hoping that he will see that Ross warrants this. And, that's one point about the hashtags, but also about the petition. People say, well, there's no magic number with the petition, this is futile. And I'm like, well, it's a PR tool. It's showing a movement behind someone. It's showing that almost 300,000 people have signed this, that want this. It gives And I've told this to various people that I want to have their support, and they're like, wow, they had no idea. So it does matter. It's a way to speak out, and please share it too.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just signing it, but share it. And exponentially, we can get to 500,000, which is my goal.
Your next
So,
one.
but I think we can.
Absolutely. Ultimately, what I've tried to discuss tonight is bring into a picture of Ross's individual challenges and create a portrait, if you will, of the same challenges that we all face. Right. To your point, the American Constitution was put in place to protect Americans from out of control, corrupted, failed, weaponized, lethal governments at every single level. We used to, on this show, ask, particularly when ACLU lawyers would come on, we would talk about, well, which amendment of the Constitution do you think is most under fire? Most ironically, attorneys would respond the fourth. Civilians would often respond with the first or second, that being the two that they're most intimate with. Very few Americans, until really this generation, have had to come to grips with the sixth. So, the notion that this is one individual case, this is one person, it can't happen to me, it won't happen to me. If the last few months haven't proven to you that the last line of defense for all of us is that daily battle in upholding a variety of amendments, a variety of the portions of this Constitution, I don't know what I can do to convince you. If I can't convince you now that the government is not your friend, that the government, I'll use the words of my guest in the 9 o'clock hour, is a cancer, is a tumor, that left unchecked will consume you. At worst, if at least battled routinely, will be allowed to achieve some level of stasis. If I can't convince you of that now, I'm not sure what I can do. It is time for people to, it's almost cliche, to wake the hell up. Because not only is this happening to some, it's happening to almost all of us at some level. This is not the fever dreams of a conspiracy theorist. This is the reality of a conspiracy realist.
Exactly, conspiracy realist. I like that. I say often,
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. You're doing great.
And this is really, Ross Ulbricht is no longer, as extreme as his situation is, can no longer be can be sort of compartmentalized in that little safe portion of your mind. Is that can't possibly happen to me. That can't possibly happen to anyone I know. It's happening.
Yeah,
it requires all of us
and
to.
As I say, there's thousands of people that are in this sentences for nonviolent crimes.
This Kafkaesque nightmare that we call our judicial system now, which is we've got a government designed literally as a laundry chute to prison, where the simplest infraction of a civil crime can escalate to a point at a moment like this in history to literally destroying you and your family. If I could put a thin smile on it, we have a saying where I come from in New York: denial ain't a river in Egypt. This is real. It's happening. It's freeross.org. What folks need to do who listen to this now or who are listening to this in the future is stop what you're doing. Invest a couple of damn minutes. Sign the petition. Read a little bit. I guarantee you will find it chilling. I guarantee you will find examples of this at some point somewhere in your life. But finally, I guarantee you, if you do nothing, then these situations will accelerate. These situations will become the rule of law. These situations will become the everyday, and we will have lost our freedoms permanently. Lynn, I'm not going to these are difficult conversations we had. Folks who know me know that I'm the guy that just reels it off and spews it out and talks and talks. When you come on the air, it's challenging me because it's very emotional. I will spare you the cliches. I will spare you the facile efforts at goodwill. Our thoughts and prayers are with you, because quite frankly, the time has
I'll
passed.
take those.
Yeah, but the time has passed for thoughts and prayers.
No.
The time is now for action. So I will tell you that we think of your situation often here. We try to find ways to, along with a lot of very good people. There's a lot of very good people involved in this, and which is why you need to go to the site, which is why you need to look over this sort of honor roll that spins in front of you of some of the great minds in this country, along with the regular guys like me who find this to be despicable and get so emotional about it. Lynn, that you are not alone. Ross is not alone, and that there is an entire nation of people who are gradually, if I can use that word, waking up to this. So if we can channel any positive energy out of the tragedy that is in fact COVID-19, it is hopefully a recognition that you're seeing in your life, perhaps for the very first time, your government, state, local, federal, you name it, ripping away your rights, acting callously with regard to your financial future, acting incompetently with regard to your health future, a health future that they have hijacked from any sort of private free market support. They've taken over, and now they are killing us because of their incompetence. If the collective failure that you see in front of you as a result of COVID-19, you can extrapolate onto this criminal justice system in situations like Ross Ulbricht, then maybe some tiny silver lining will have come of this. And Lynn, that's all I got. Christ, I've tried to think of other things.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I just want to say I totally agree with you, and I think we're at a tipping point in history. We really are. We're at a crossroads, and we may have tipped over, I don't know, but, are we going to go towards innovation, creativity, freedom? Because creativity only happens in freedom. Or are we going to keep moving towards a surveillance state and government control, which, that's kind of where we are right now. And it's like you say, it's up to us. I mean, they're not just going to stop. They've accelerated even before COVID-19. It was alarming. And so, yeah, I would completely agree. And I think we are in danger of losing our freedoms, and that would be a terrible, terrible thing.
Well, we had the opportunity. We have the warning. The clear shot was sent across the bow. Now all of us are seeing it in our daily lives. Lynn, give folks one last shot at where they can read about Ross, how they can react, where they can sign a petition.
Yeah, just our hub is freeross.org, and everything's there. And it's a pretty in-depth site. You can really dig deeply in there because it's very footnoted too. So you can follow the footnotes. I mean, it depends how much you want to do that, but you can also get a very good idea of some of what it's about just looking at it, going through it. And I do recommend going to the widespread support page. We have just a huge amount of very prominent people who are saying, no, this isn't right, this sentence is wrong, and it has to be corrected. And that's all you really need to know to sign the petition. You don't even need to get into all the details of the case. All you need to know or think to sign it is not right for a first-time, nonviolent offender to have double life plus 40 years without the possibility of parole, a walking death sentence. It's not life in prison, it is death in prison. That is the sentence for my son. And that's all you need to know to sign it and share it, because this isn't right. And it does put us all in peril. It's not just Ross, it's all of us.
God bless you, Lynn Ulbricht. God bless Ross Ulbricht. And most importantly, it's time to free Ross. Thank you so much.
Free Ross 2020. Yep.
God bless.
Thank you.
We're going to take a very brief break right now. We ran a little bit into our next show, but it was important. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage-porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network here at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty, mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalitionradionetwork.com or our older site at coalitionradio.us. Stay tuned. We're going to get Adam Kokesh on the line. He is just off of a debate and wanted to join us for something of a town hall. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.